On a seemingly normal evening of March 29, 1997, an ordinary guard and driver loaded around $19 million in the back of an unmarked van, shackled and kidnapped two Loomis Fargo employees, and vanished. The next morning, when the FBI arrived at the cash depot, they realized no one could enter the facility and opened the vault door due to a set timer on the door that only automatically opened by the end of the day. The authorities quickly realized the depot had been robbed, which led to a nationwide hunt, perhaps an international manhunt, for an ordinary guard who outsmarted the FBI, leaving them to chase nothing but the ghosts. On the evening of March 29, 1997, in Jacksonville, Florida, a Loomis Fargo guard and driver, Philip Johnson, returned from a cash pickup job around the city, reversed his truck inside the fenced-in complex, and got out of the truck to transfer millions of dollars in collection money into the 20-ton ballistic timer vault. During the time, the whole facility was empty except for two of his co-workers, Dan Smith and James Brown. Philip Johnson had been working for the company for almost 10 years, being paid $7 an hour to haul millions of dollars from various retail fronts around the city, completely exposed to external threats of being robbed or even worse. For 10 years, he had performed this extremely risky job without any health insurance, pension, or overtime. By this time, he was full of resentment for his employer and decided to collect his final paycheck, a check worth $19 million. But being underpaid was not the only reason for him to rob the depot. As Phil's co-workers were busy moving money inside the vault, he picked up Dan's company-issued revolver from a nearby table, pointed at Dan and James, and asked them to handcuff and shackle themselves and kneel on the floor. Dan and James, completely disconcerted by Phil's action, asked him what was he doing, and his action would land him behind the bars. But Phil, with his unwavering determination, had already made up his mind. He was robbing the Loomis Cash Depot. After taking control over Dan and James, Phil goes inside the vault and removes as many cash bags as he could and fills an unmarked company van parked nearby with almost $19 million, forces Dan and James to sit on the pile of cash bags, drive out of the facility, and escapes. But instead of driving out of the city as quickly as possible with the risk of authorities finding about the heist and catching up to him, he drives to his home just a mile away from the cash depot. He opens the back door and orders James Brown to step out, leaving Dan locked up in the van. Both Phil and James go inside the house. Phil opens a small closet in his room, which had plumbing fixtures, and handcuffs James to the pipes. Before leaving, Phil goes to his fridge, pulls out sandwiches, some snacks, and water, and places it near James and says, "I'm sorry, bud, but it's not personal. It's something much bigger you won't understand. Eat something and have some rest." Phil closes the closet, locks his house, and leaves. He exits the city and drives north for almost 2 hours before making a stop at a gas station. Phil puts more gas into the van, goes inside the gas store, and buys more food, snacks, and water. After purchasing enough supplies, Phil drives further north before finally stopping in a wooded area near Asheville, North Carolina. Phil gets out of the van, looks around to make sure no one was watching his actions. He unlocks the back door again and orders Dan Smith to step out. He walks Dan to the side of the forest trail, finds an appropriate tree, and shackles him to the tree trunk. He then places snacks, food, and water near Dan, apologizes to Dan as well for his actions, and promises that he will call somebody about his exact location to rescue him, and leaves the area. Next morning, he drives to a storage unit facility. He goes to the office and rents a 10 by 20 single unit. The manager asks him to pay the rental fee and sign the papers, unbeknownst to the fact that the contents Phil would be transferring into the unit could potentially buy the whole facility many times over. Phil pays the rent, signs the paperwork, exits the office, and waits in his van to make sure the manager was still busy in his office. Once he gains the confidence, he slowly backs up the van into the unit and carefully transfers all the money into the storage. He takes a few $1,000s of the stolen money, logs the unit, and leaves. He then stops on the side of the road in Nashville, logs the van, abandons it, and vanishes on foot. Back in Jacksonville, when a Loomis Fargo employee arrived for his Sunday morning shift, he found himself logged out of the facility. He called a supervisor who had master keys with him all the time. He arrived at the depot, and both were able to access the facility. But inside, they found that the white unmarked company van was missing and the vault was logged, set on a timer, which means the staff had no access to the vault until later in the day. The supervisor took a quick look at the active CCTV inside the vault room and saw multiple empty cabinets with hundreds of cash bags missing. They came to the conclusion that the vault had been robbed. The police arrived quickly on the scene and estimated a total value of the theft to be more than at least $18 million. And because the money was federal money, the investigation quickly fell on the shoulders of the FBI. The FBI started with the most obvious information available, the employee list. A quick inspection of the files led them to a conclusion that all employees had been accounted for except for the three: Philip Johnson, Dan Smith, and James Brown, along with Phil's file missing from the office. The investigators concluded that these three employees must be the perpetrators of the biggest cash heist in the history of America during the time. The authorities rolled into action and began a nationwide hunt to track down Phil, Dan, and James. Meanwhile, 430 miles north of Jacksonville, Dan Smith, who was tied to a tree in the Blue Ridge Mountains, managed to pick the lock of his shackle using his Swiss Army knife, freed himself, and started walking on the trail in the hopes of finding any help. Unfortunately, a forest ranger spotted him and she was able to rescue Dan from the remote area. The ranger quickly informed the authorities in Jacksonville about Dan Smith, and the FBI had their first major breakthrough in the case only 16 hours after the heist. With the help of Dan's information, the FBI quickly arrived at Phil's house and were able to rescue James Brown, still tied up to a closet pipe. Both Dan and James are brought in the FBI office for further questioning and are asked to describe everything in as much detail as possible so they can find Philip Johnson and the stolen $19 million. Dan and James mentioned that while they were busy moving cash into the vault, Phil broke the protocol of not leaving the building during the money transfer procedure, and he probably went to his car to pick up shackles he brought with him to tie Dan and James. They also mentioned that after filling the van with cash, he removed the CCTV tapes from the office to raise any evidence of him committing the robbery. Meanwhile, near Asheville, an Army sergeant spotted a white van abandoned by Philip Johnson. The FBI arrived at the scene and were able to determine that it was indeed the Loomis Company van used by Phil to execute the heist. But there was no sign of him or anyone spotting him in the entire southeast United States. It was like he had vanished into thin air with only a few crumbs left behind for the authorities to chew on. Months go by in the nationwide hunt for Philip Johnson with no success. Therefore, the FBI shifted their focus on finding the money. They investigate multiple storage units in Jacksonville, Asheville, and the Mountain Home area, but are unable to find any trace of the stolen $19 million. Until one day, while investigating Phil's house, they had a breakthrough: a paper trail, an old cut-up photograph of an unknown man that set the clock of the investigation 5 years back in 1992. The authorities discovered that Phil Johnson used to live in the same house with a roommate, and he secretly stole his photos to prepare fake IDs and passports. This made the FBI realize that Phil had been planning for the biggest heist for at least 5 years. They also found scrapbooks and notes in Spanish indicating that Phil was covertly learning to speak Spanish. These new pieces of evidence reoriented the FBI's compass toward Mexico. According to FBI, Phil Johnson must have fled to Mexico or any other Spanish-speaking country with Mexico on their priority list because of the shared US-Mexico border with thousands of travelers crossing the border each day. Few investigators tried to look for Phil near border towns of both US and Mexico with no signs of finding Phil. Until one fateful day, Philip Johnson, who was actually, according to FBI speculation, hiding in Mexico, decided to come back to the United States. He booked a direct bus service between Mexico and the US, crossing at the Gateway International Bridge in Brownsville, Texas. As the bus arrived at the border, Border Customs Officer Virginia Rodriguez ordered the passengers to deboard the bus for a routine inspection. And one of the passengers was Philip Johnson. However, the border agents were unable to recognize him. The agents asked standard questions like what was their purpose in the United States and how long they were planning to stay in the country. When Virginia approached Phil and asked, he being an American citizen, what was he doing in Mexico, Phil was unable to clearly answer her question. This immediately raised suspicion, and she asked Phil to present his ID. Phil gave Virginia a fake ID. The officer ran his ID and it came back as a positive alias name connected to the most wanted criminal, Philip Noel Johnson. Virginia ordered other officers to search his luggage, and upon inspection, they found multiple fake IDs, passports, and over $10,000 in cash. Virginia finally had the positive ID that they indeed have found Philip Johnson. He's immediately handcuffed and handed over to the authorities, but the money was still out there. In fact, this case became so famous that just a few months after the Jacksonville heist, in October of the same year in Charlotte, North Carolina, a man who was deeply in love with another Loomis employee pulled off a $17 million heist and vanished. The FBI, now with Phil in custody, asked him about the money, but he repeatedly mentioned he had no idea about the money. Fortunately, the authorities found a receipt with the name Roger D. Lauder in his luggage from a hotel in Mexico City. When the FBI resumed the hunt for the stolen money again in the areas of Asheville and Mountain Home in North Carolina, they were able to find a rented storage unit booked under the same name at a 100-unit storage facility in Mountain Home. The FBI arrived quickly, and as they opened the storage unit, all the money was right there, just sitting on the floor as it was waiting to be found. Philip Noel Johnson was found guilty of charges of money laundering, kidnapping, and violation of interstate commerce. He was sentenced to 25 years in maximum security federal prison.